The deed was already signed by the time Cecily Holt heard about it. She heard it the way most things reached her in those days, through the edge of a conversation she was not meant to be part of. She had come into the east corridor of Aldersham Park to return a book to the library, walking quietly as she always walked, wearing the plain dove-gray gown she always wore, a woman so little remarked upon in that house that the footman sometimes forgot to step aside for her. She had been employed as the companion to Lady Fairbridge for 11 months, and in 11 months she had learned that invisibility, while not comfortable, was in certain circumstances a kind of freedom. That morning, freedom offered her the following: Lord Gerald Patmore, the younger Fairbridge brother, speaking to the family solicitor in the half-open doorway of the study. His voice was low and quick, the voice of a man concluding something. The name Thornfield was spoken. Then the figure of £12,000. Then, with a finality that landed in the corridor like a stone dropped into still water, the word done. Cecily did not stop walking. She carried the book to the library, placed it on its shelf, and stood for a moment at the window overlooking the south lawn while the particular quality of that word settled inside her chest. Thornfield. It was not simply an estate. It had been the Holt estate, her father's estate, the estate she had grown up inside, the house where she had learned to read in the library window seat with her shoes off and her stockings damp from the grass. It had been lost 3 years ago to her father's debts, sold to settle an account she had not known existed until the morning the solicitor arrived and her father's study door stayed closed for 4 hours. The purchaser at that time had been Lord Fairbridge, the elder brother, now lately dead. The estate had passed, along with his other assets, into the management of the family. Gerald Patmore, who had never set foot in Thornfield, had now sold it to Sir Edmund Vane. She knew the name. Everyone within 30 miles knew the name. Sir Edmund Vane was the sort of man the Regency season produced in perfect and terrible precision. Wealthy, socially impeccable. The grandson of a baronet who had understood that money invested in land returned in influence, and influence invested in connection returned in power. He was 34 years old and not yet married, a fact the matchmaking apparatus of 3 counties had spent 4 seasons attempting to remedy. He was said to be cold. He was said to be methodical. He was said to have bought the Fairbridge property specifically because it bordered his own holdings at Vane Court and would, when combined, constitute the largest private estate in the county. Thornfield would disappear into Vane Court as a stream disappears into a river. Cecily stood at the library window for a long time. Then she went to write a letter. If she had been a different kind of woman, the letter would have gone to a sympathetic relative, or to a friend of her father's who retained some influence in legal matters, or to the solicitor who had handled the original sale and might be persuaded to advise her on appeal. Cecily was not that kind of woman. The letter she wrote went to her father's former man of business, a Mr. Aldous Ferris, now retired to Bath, who had been the only person in her father's circle who had ever spoken to her directly, rather than over her head. She addressed it carefully. She sealed it. She sent it with the morning's post, and she said nothing to anyone. That was the beginning. What she did not yet know was that Sir Edmund Vane had been watching her for 6 weeks. The first time he had seen her was at the Aldersham harvest supper, where she had been seated at the end of the second table, well below the salt, between the vicar's wife and a young cousin of the Fairbridges, who spent the meal looking over her shoulder at someone more interesting. Cecily had eaten her meal steadily and without apparent distress. She had answered the vicar's wife's questions about London with quiet accuracy, and then, when the conversation lagged, had simply sat in possession of her own quiet, as though it were a piece of furniture she owned. Most women in her position, Edmund had noticed, worked very hard at appearing not to notice their position. Cecily Holt did not appear to work at anything. She was present and composed and apparently indifferent to the room's verdict. He had found this, in his own private lexicon, interesting. He had not yet determined what to do with interesting. The match the county expected him to make was Miss Honoria Cheltenham, daughter of Sir Peter Cheltenham, whose land abutted Vane Court on its western edge, and whose social standing made her what Lady Gerald Patmore called, with her fan at the precise right angle, the obvious choice. Miss Cheltenham was 22 years old, auburn-haired, and perfectly calibrated in the social machinery of their world, the kind of young woman who had been constructed for exactly this outcome, and knew it, and moved through her preparation with a serene and practiced confidence. She was, in every measurable particular, the correct choice. Edmund had yet to feel, in Miss Cheltenham's company, anything that resembled a pulse. He had told himself this was his own deficiency. He had told himself this for 2 years. He was 34, old enough to know that feeling was unreliable, and young enough, in the particular arithmetic of grief, that the wound was still doing its slow work on him. His wife, Clara, had died 4 years ago in her second confinement, and what Edmund Vane had lost in that moment was not only Clara herself, but the version of himself that had believed, with the simple confidence of a man who had never needed to question it, that what he built would hold. He had not remarried. He had not tried to. The world had decided he was simply careful. That was the word Lord Gerald Patmore used when the topic arose, usually in Edmund's hearing. Careful. As though grief, in a man, read as prudence. It was at a small dinner at Fairbridge Court, 3 weeks after the Thornfield transaction was completed, that Edmund Vane first found himself in direct proximity to Cecily Holt. She had been invited as a courtesy to Lady Fairbridge, who liked to have her companion present when the company was small, and she herself was tired. Cecily had been seated at the far end of the table, next to the vicar, and had spent most of the meal in her customary and apparently total self-possession. Midway through the second remove, the vicar had said something Edmund could not hear, and Cecily had replied in a low, level voice, and the vicar had gone quite still for a moment, and then nodded in a way that indicated not polite agreement, but genuine recognition. Edmund had watched this from across the table and thought, "She has just told him something true." After dinner, in the drawing room, he had crossed the room to where she stood with her needlework. "Miss Holt," he said. She looked up. Her eyes were gray, not unlike the gown she wore, and they registered him without visible alarm or visible eagerness, which he found, he realized, a relief. "Sir Edmund," she said. "You said something to the vicar at table," he said. "Something that surprised him." A pause. She looked at him with what he could only describe as assessment. "I told him that his sermon on the parable of the talents had misread the text," she said. "I apologized for doing so. He said he would consider it." "Had it?" "Yes," she said simply. "But he is a kind man, and will reach the correction on his own, in time." Edmund said nothing for a moment. She returned to her needlework with the unhurried equanimity of someone who had given what was asked and did not require a response. "You are from this county originally," he said. "I am," she said. "Thornfield," he said. The needle did not pause. Something in the set of her shoulders, some nearly imperceptible alteration, was a thing his body registered before his mind did. "Thornfield," she agreed, her voice level. He stood there for a moment longer, aware that he had said something that had cost her something, and aware also that she had not permitted him to see the cost. Then Lady Fairbridge called from across the room, and the moment ended. He thought about it on the drive home. He thought about it again the following morning, standing at the window of his study while the steward waited. He was, he told himself, thinking about property. He was thinking about the question of a name. He was not quite persuaded by this. If you have stayed with Cecily this far, you understand something of what she was. A woman who had been told, by a sequence of losses she had not chosen, that her presence in the world was contingent, that she was owed nothing, that the correct posture was gratitude for what remained. She had absorbed this instruction without internalizing it. She went on thinking and observing and acting from her own judgment, as though she had not received it. What she received from Mr. Aldous Ferris, in Bath, was a reply she had not entirely expected. He had been her father's man of business, yes. He had also, as it transpired, been the executor of a small trust her father had established in her name many years ago, a trust she had known nothing of, drawn from a sum her maternal grandmother had placed in settlement before her death, a sum modest enough to have gone unremarked in the chaos of the estate's dissolution, and carefully enough structured to have survived it. It was not £12,000. It was not close to £12,000. It was, Mr. Ferris wrote in his careful clerk's hand, enough, combined with a particular instrument of credit he believed could be arranged through his former banking connections, to make an offer on a parcel of land. Not all of Thornfield. The western parcel. The kitchen gardens, the orchard, the gamekeeper's cottage, and the small field that had been, in her father's time, planted with lavender and let run wild, a field she had walked in every summer of her childhood. It was the smallest fragment of what had been lost. It was also the piece she knew. She wrote back the same day. What followed was the work of 6 weeks, conducted entirely in correspondence and entirely without the knowledge of Lady Fairbridge or anyone at Fairbridge Court. Cecily wrote letters in the early mornings and received them on the afternoons when she sorted Lady Fairbridge's post, a task the old woman had given over to her entirely. She was not dishonest in any of this. She had not been asked. She had not been forbidden. She worked in the space that invisibility afforded, and she worked steadily. The thing she had not calculated was Sir Edmund Vane. He came to Fairbridge Court again in the second week of November, and this time Lady Gerald Patmore organized a card party to mark the occasion, and this time Miss Cheltenham was present with her mother, and the room had arranged itself, as rooms tended to do in the presence of these particular players, into a legible text. Miss Cheltenham at the piano, Sir Edmund at the window, Lady Gerald Patmore moving between them with the focused application of a woman who understood that certain arrangements were nearly complete and required only the smallest final pressure. Cecily sat near the fire with her book. Lord Gerald Patmore, passing behind her chair, said to his wife in a voice pitched for intimacy and arriving instead at the ears of everyone in the room's periphery. "The companion is still here, is she? I thought she would have moved on by now. Not much scope for advancement in that position, for a girl with that sort of mind," Lady Gerald Patmore replied, not quite looking at Cecily, her voice politely careless. "She suits Mamma perfectly well." "One does not need scope when one has adequate station, Gerald." Cecily turned her page. Miss Cheltenham, from the piano bench, said nothing but allowed her eyes to travel briefly across the room in Cecily's direction, with the polite and composed indifference of someone who had not heard anything and was making certain this was known. At the window, Edmund Vane had gone very still. He said nothing. He crossed the room 15 minutes later to collect his glass from a side table that happened to place him within speaking distance of the fire and of Cecily's chair, and he stood there for a moment without appearing to speak to her at all, and then said, as though continuing a prior conversation, "What are you reading?" "A history of property law in England," she said without looking up. "The chapter on equitable title." A pause. "That is a specific chapter." "It is a specific subject," she said. and this time she did look up, and they regarded each other for the length of a breath. And something passed between them that was not yet named and was not yet safe to name. "Thornfield," he said again, very quietly. "It is a matter of public record," she said equally quietly, "that the western parcel has been listed for separate sale by your agent. It is. I have made an offer on it." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. She held his gaze for all of them. "I was not informed," he said. "You may choose to be informed now," she said, and returned to her chapter. She heard him set down his glass on the side table. She heard him cross the room. She did not look up again, because looking up would have cost her composure, and composure was the one thing she could not afford to spend. Her pulse was not composure. Her pulse was its own business entirely, a quick and treacherous signal she had no authority over and which she was choosing, in this moment, to ignore. What Edmund Vane did when he reached his own house at 11 o'clock that evening, he sent for his steward, confirmed the name of the woman who had submitted the offer on the western parcel, and then sat alone at his desk for a long time without writing anything. He had not known it was her. He was not certain now what that knowledge changed. He was certain that it changed something. The morning his solicitor brought him the documentation on her offer, he read it twice. The trust was genuine. The credit instrument was sound. The offer was below what he might command from another buyer, but it was not insultingly below it, and it was secured, which many larger offers from land speculators were not. He had no technical reason to refuse it. He had, he admitted to himself, been assuming she was helpless. This was the moment, though he did not know it yet, in which something his grief had built over 4 years began the first slow session of its hold. He wrote to his solicitor. He accepted the offer in principle, subject to a meeting. The meeting was proposed for the 2nd week of December, at Thornfield itself. She arrived in a hired carriage, wearing the gray gown and a heavier cloak borrowed from Lady Fairbridge's wardrobe. Edmund was already there, standing in the entrance hall of the empty house, his breath visible in the cold air, his coat dark against the pale stone walls. There were no servants, only his steward at a respectful distance near the door. The house smelled of cold plaster and dust, and the particular absence that houses accumulate in the spaces between their lives. Cecily walked through the door and stopped. She had not been back to Thornfield since the morning the solicitor had come, 3 years ago. She had not let herself think about what it would cost her to return. She had, apparently, miscalculated. She stood in the entrance hall and looked up at the cornice and down at the flagstone floor and thought, "I grew up here." And the thought was so plain and so undefended that she felt it in her throat. Edmund watched her. He did not speak immediately. He allowed the silence to be what it was. Then he said, very quietly, "I was not aware, when the transaction with Patmore was arranged, of your connection to this property." "It would not have been relevant," she said, her voice steady. "The sale was legal." "It was. My offer is also legal." "It is." He paused. "I wished to see you here before the papers were signed. I wished to understand what you intended." She turned to look at him. "I intend to cultivate the lavender field. I intend to manage the kitchen gardens. I intend to live in the gamekeeper's cottage, which is in reasonable repair, on a sum that is modest but sufficient." She held his gaze. "I intend to do this, without anyone's assistance, including yours." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The cottage roof requires attention before February. I have accounted for that. The kitchen garden wall has a section near the south gate that will not hold another winter. I have accounted for that as well." He looked at her for a long, measured moment. "Miss Holt," he said, "I find that I have a great many things to account for." It was not a declaration. It was not anything she could safely interpret. His face, which had been composed and still in every prior encounter, had shifted by some fraction she could not name but could certainly feel. A kind of loosening, as though something held had been permitted to set down its weight, she said. "I did not come here to ask for your consideration, Sir Edmund." "No," he said. "I am aware of that. I find, however, that you have it." They walked the western parcel that afternoon, the two of them and the steward at his distance, moving through the bare lavender field where the old stems were gray and bent under the weight of the season, and through the kitchen gardens where the espalier pear trees were bare against the stone wall, and past the orchard where 3 of the old apple trees had dropped their limbs in the autumn wind, and the limbs lay where they had fallen, patient in the frost. Edmund said little. Cecily said little. What was communicated between them was carried, as most true communication is, by the body, the careful maintenance of a proper distance, and the awareness of that distance as a chosen and deliberate thing. He handed her the documents that afternoon in the empty library, where the shelves were stripped bare and the window seat had a crack along its frame that let in the cold. She signed them at the table where her father had once made her read Latin before she was allowed to go out to the lavender field. Edmund watched her sign. He said nothing until she had finished and set down the pen. "There is a dinner at Fairbridge Court on the 23rd, he said. "Lady Fairbridge has invited me. I understand you will be present." "As her companion, yes." "I will look for you," he said, "in whatever capacity the evening offers." She did not allow herself to respond to this. She closed the document folder and gathered her cloak. In the carriage going back to Fairbridge Court, she sat with her hands folded and the cold coming in at the window seam, and thought about the way he had said, "I will look for you," and about the particular quality of his stillness in the lavender field, and about the fact that he had noticed the Southgate wall, which she had also noticed, and had not said it as a correction, but as a shared observation. This was a very small thing. She was not, she told herself firmly, going to make anything of a very small thing. The dinner at Fairbridge Court on the 23rd was a larger affair than the card party had been. Lady Gerald Patmore had arranged it as the season's last formal event before Christmas, and she had arranged it with the specific architecture of a woman who had decided that the calendar would not be permitted to close without a certain announcement. Miss Cheltenham was present. Her mother was present. Sir Peter Cheltenham was present, looking entirely willing. The room had the quality of a formal negotiation dressed in candlelight. Cecily was seated, as she usually was at these events, at the table's end below the salt, next to an elderly clergyman and a visiting cousin from Shropshire. She wore the grey gown. She had no other evening gown, and she had long since made her peace with this. Lord Gerald Patmore, arriving with his wife at the head of the table, said to the cousin from Shropshire, who had asked who the grey woman at the end was, "Oh, that is Mamma's companion, Miss Holt. She was from Thornfield originally, before the property changed hands. A capable enough creature, but rather spent her best years in reduced circumstances. You know how it is with girls who had expectations, and then did not." The cousin from Shropshire said, "Ah," and looked at Cecily with the brief and sliding glance of a person reassigning a category. Cecily had heard this, or something very like it, before. She turned her attention to her soup. At the head of the table, Edmund Vane had also heard it. He did not look at Cecily. He looked at Lord Gerald Patmore with the level attention of a man who had filed something and would not forget where he had put it. The dinner proceeded through its removes. The conversation at Edmund's end of the table moved through politics and sport and the Christmas prospects of various county families. Miss Cheltenham, seated to his left, was exactly as she always was, pleasant, composed, completely legible. She said the correct things in the correct order. She looked at him with the specific attention of a woman who had been told her entire life that she was the correct answer and had no particular reason to doubt it. Edmund answered her when addressed. He was not unkind. He was simply, for the duration of the evening, not quite present in the conversation in the way she required. After dinner, in the drawing room, Lady Gerald Patmore arranged herself near the piano with the satisfaction of a woman about to deliver a conclusion. She called the company's attention with a light touch of her fan against her palm. She said that she was delighted to announce that Sir Edmund Vane had expressed to her husband his intention to formally call upon the Cheltenham family in the new year with a proposal in mind, a delightful development which she was certain would follow. Edmund said, his voice carrying across the room, "Lady Patmore." The room went still. He was standing near the center of the drawing room, which he had entered from the far door a moment earlier, and which placed him in a position that the room's geometry did not quite allow anyone to ignore. "I have expressed no such intention," he said. His voice was level. It carried without being raised. Lady Gerald Patmore's fan suspended at its current angle. Miss Cheltenham looked at her mother. Her mother looked at Sir Peter. Edmund crossed the room. He crossed it in the direction of the fireplace, where Cecily sat with her book, which she had been holding without reading for the better part of an hour. He stopped in front of her. "Miss Holt," he said, in the same level voice, in the same room, in front of the same company that had twice watched Lord Gerald Patmore place her below his regard. "I have spoken to my solicitor. The cottage at Thornfield will require significant work before it is habitable for a woman alone. I have a proposal I would like to make to you, if you are willing to hear it." She looked up from her book. Her face was still. Something behind it was not. "The proposal is this," he said. "I would like you to inhabit Thornfield in a capacity that is not limited to the western parcel. I would like you to inhabit it as its mistress, as my wife, if you are willing. The property would be restored to your name in the settlement. I would consider this a service I owed, not a favor I bestowed. And I would consider the arrangement one I wished, entirely for my own reasons." The room was so quiet that the fire could be heard. "She bought it back," said the cousin from Shropshire, half to herself, in a tone of pure and helpless recognition. It was not perhaps the precise framing Edmund would have chosen. It was not wrong. Cecily said, after a moment that lasted the length of the rest of her composure, "That is a very practical proposal, Sir Edmund." "I am a practical man," he said, "when I choose to be." She stood. She was nearly at his height, and he did not step back to accommodate the distance. And this was its own communication. "Then I accept the proposal practically," she said, "and rather more than that." What she did not say, in front of 30 witnesses and a cousin from Shropshire and Lady Gerald Patmore's stilled fan, and thought of what she had known in the lavender field, when he noticed the Southgate wall, that she had known in the library at Thornfield, when he let her sign the documents without qualifying her capability, that the word "I will look for you" had taken up residence in her chest and had not left it, that she had, in the 11 months of being invisible in that house, never once expected this. She had expected to endure. She had received, instead, a man who had been watching. Lady Gerald Patmore said later to her husband that she had been misled regarding Sir Edmund's intentions and considered it a considerable discourtesy. Lord Gerald Patmore said that he supposed it could not be helped. Miss Cheltenham said nothing at all, but she left the party 20 minutes after the announcement with her chin at the angle of a woman who understood that the evening had been a scene she was not the lead of, and who was still deciding how she felt about that. The vicar, who had also been present, said to his wife on the drive home that Miss Holt had always struck him as a woman of uncommon perception, and that he was revising his sermon on the parable of the talents. Edmund and Cecily left the drawing room after the minimum sufficient time, which was not very long, and stood for a moment in the corridor outside, while the sounds of the recovering party filtered through the door. "I owe you an apology," he said. "For what, specifically?" "For not knowing whose hands had made the original offer on the western parcel," he said. "I should have known. I had taken some interest in your situation, and I should have been more attentive." "You could not have known I had a trust," she said. "No," he said. "But I should have known you would find a way." She looked at him. He looked at her. The corridor was cold, and the candles were burning low, and she was wearing the gray gown she had always worn. And she was standing, for the first time since she had left Thornfield 3 years ago, as someone who would return to it. "The lavender field," she said, "will need clearing before spring." "Yes," he said. "I would like to do it myself." "I know," he said. "I will be there." She had not known she needed to hear that. She felt it when he said it, in the very oldest part of her chest, the part that had learned to be quiet about what it needed. She did not say this. She did not need to. He had, it seemed, already read the chapter. On a morning in the following March, when the worst of the winter had passed, and the first cold light of the new season was coming in over the Thornfield estate from the east, a woman walked out through the kitchen garden gate and down to the lavender field with a pair of garden shears in her hand and her skirts damp at the hem from the grass. The field was bare and gray, and the old stems were bent where the wind had worked them over the winter, and there was work here, patient and specific, and hers. She began at the near row and worked steadily, and the morning was cold and bright, and somewhere behind her the house was standing with its windows catching the light, and it was hers, and she was, after a long time of not being, exactly where she was. He found her there an hour later. He said nothing. He picked up the second pair of shears from the garden wall where she had left them, and he began on the far row. They worked in silence until the light changed, and the cold softened, and the field began, slowly, to look like something that could bloom. The weeks between the signing of the documents at Thornfield and the dinner at Fairbridge Court were not quiet ones for Cecily. She had accepted the offer on the western parcel. She had received the confirmation from Mr. Ferris in Bath and the countersigned documents from Edmund's solicitor, and she had folded them and placed them in the inside pocket of her cloak, where they rested against her ribs with the specific and grounding weight of something real. What she had not rested with, though she tried to on several evenings when Lady Fairbridge had gone to bed early and the house was still, was what to do about Sir Edmund Vane. She knew what the county expected of him. She had watched it being arranged at the card party with the unobstructed clarity of someone seated entirely outside the arrangement. She had seen how Lady Gerald Patmore moved between him and Miss Cheltenham like a woman tending a fire she was confident would catch. She had seen how Miss Cheltenham accepted this with the composed ease of a young woman who had never had occasion to question whether she would be chosen. She had seen how Edmund watched all of it from the window with the expression of a man who had arrived at a calculation and found it insufficient. She had not let herself think about what that insufficiency meant. She was a companion, not a debutante. She owned, pending final signing, a kitchen garden and a lavender field. She had come to Fairbridge Court to survive, and survival was not the same thing as expectation. But she was honest with herself in the way that women who have lost a great deal tend to be honest, stripped of the luxury of comfortable self-deception, and so she permitted herself to know, in the private accounting she conducted with herself each morning, that she had thought about him. That she had thought about him crossing the corridor to where she sat with her needlework at the card party, and asking what she had said to the vicar, and listening to her answer with the specific attention of a man who expected accuracy and had received it. That she had thought about the lavender field and his steady attention on the bare stems, and the way he had said, "I will look for you," in the tone of a man stating a fact rather than extending a courtesy. She had told herself this was nothing. She was a practical woman. She had told herself this a great many times. It was on one of these evenings, a Tuesday in the last week of November, that Lady Fairbridge called her into the sitting room and regarded her with the particular regard of an elderly woman who has been paying very close attention for 11 months without appearing to. "Sir Edmund Vane," Lady Fairbridge said, without preamble, "is not in love with Honoria Cheltenham." Cecily kept her expression still. "I would not be in a position to know that, ma'am." "No," said Lady Fairbridge. "You would be in a position to observe it, which is different. And you have observed it, because you observe everything in this house, which is one of the reasons I have kept you. The other reason is that you correct me when I am wrong in small matters, and do not correct me when I am wrong in large ones, which is a rare calibration in a companion." She held Cecily's gaze. "What are you proposing to do about the western parcel?" "I have made an offer. It has been accepted in principle." "And you intend to live there, alone?" "I intend to manage it," Cecily said. "Yes." Lady Fairbridge was quiet for a moment. She was a woman who had survived 2 husbands and 4 decades of this particular county's social machinery, and she looked at Cecily with the frank and level assessment of someone who had long since dispensed with the formalities of indirection. "You have a great deal of pride," she said, not unkindly. "I have a great deal of necessity," Cecily said. "They look similar." Lady Fairbridge smiled at that, briefly and entirely genuinely, the way women sometimes smile when they are recognizing something they last felt a long time ago. "Gerald will not announce anything tonight, at the dinner. He said as much to me this morning. Margaret, that is to say Lady Gerald Patmore, her daughter-in-law, would attempt to arrange the announcement herself if no one prevents her. She has been arranging things for this county for 15 years, and she has forgotten that arrangements require the consent of the arranged." She folded her hands in her lap. "I mention this for no particular reason." "Of course, ma'am," Cecily said. She had gone back to her room and sat for a long time on the edge of her narrow bed, with the documents from her cloak pocket unfolded in her lap. 12 acres. The lavender field. The kitchen gardens. The gamekeeper's cottage with its roof that needed attention, and its south-facing windows and the stone threshold that her father had cut his initials into as a boy. A small, illegible mark she had found again when she was 7 years old and had never told anyone about. She had thought, "It is enough." She had thought, "It is not everything. Enough is sufficient. Enough is what you build on." She had also thought. In the privacy that nothing could reach, he noticed the Southgate wall. It was the smallest possible thing. A wall? A damaged wall? A fact he had offered without commentary, without paternalism, without the implication that it was beyond her to address, simply placed beside her own assessment, like a second opinion from someone who had walked the same ground with the same attention. She had been told many things by many people since her father's estate was lost. She had been told she had expectations above her station. She had been told her education was a luxury that had produced a liability. She had been told by Lord Gerald Patmore in 3 separate conversations that capable women in reduced circumstances were best served by making peace with their situation early and applying their capabilities to the management of someone else's household. She had never been told or shown by anyone who had the authority of position and the option to offer it. That quiet confirmation. I see what you are doing, and it is sufficient. The lavender field. He had stood in it with her as though it were a thing worth standing in. As though the bare gray stems and the cold light and the broken Southgate wall were a landscape worth attending to. She had, in the privacy of that evening, before she restored the documents to their place and went down to see to Lady Fairbridge's evening tea, allowed herself to feel the full weight of how much she had wanted someone to stand there with her. Then she had gone downstairs. Lady Fairbridge had already poured her own tea, which she did when she was feeling independent, which was always a good sign. Cecily had sat down across from her, and they had drunk their tea in the companionable silence of two women who understood each other well enough not to require speech, and the fire had been very warm. And outside the windows, the November dark had been very complete. And somewhere to the south across the county, Thornfield had been waiting. It had, she thought, always been waiting. The formal settlement meeting between Edmund's solicitor and Mr. Ferris, conducted by correspondence, was completed in the first week of December. The documents were sent to Cecily for final signature on a Wednesday morning while Lady Fairbridge was receiving callers, and Cecily signed them at the writing desk in her room in the cold north light with a steadiness of hand that cost her something and which she was not inclined to apologize for. She sent the signed documents back with the afternoon post. That evening, Edmund Vane sent a note to Fairbridge Court. It was addressed to Lady Fairbridge and contained, in the formal cadence of a man who had been trained to mean what he wrote, a request to call upon the household on Thursday. It said nothing else. Lady Fairbridge read it and handed it to Cecily without comment. Cecily set it on the writing desk and looked at it for a long time. He came on Thursday. He came in the mid-morning, when Lady Gerald Patmore was out calling, and Lord Gerald was with his steward, and Lady Fairbridge received him in the small sitting-room, with Cecily present as was proper, and also, Cecily suspected, deliberate. He sat in the chair by the window. He talked about the weather and the condition of the county roads with Lady Fairbridge for the required 15 minutes. He drank his tea. He was entirely composed, and entirely, in some way Cecily could not precisely name, not here for the tea. When Lady Fairbridge found cause to leave the room for a few minutes, which she did with the practiced timing of a woman who had been orchestrating exits for 6 decades, he looked at Cecily. "The documents are final," he said. "Yes," she said. "You will need a conveyance to move your things to the cottage in the new year," he said. "I will arrange it." She opened her mouth. "That is not a favor," he said. "It is a practicality. You do not have a carriage. I do. Do not argue with me about this." She closed her mouth. A warmth had gathered in her face that she chose to attribute to the fire. "You are very decided," she said. "I am," he said, "in matters where the decision is clear." He looked at her steadily. She looked back. Outside the window, the December light was thin and cold on the garden, and the bare branches of the elm moved in the wind, and the fire crackled between them. "Mr. Ferris," she said, "mentioned in his last letter that my mother's family had a tradition of growing lavender for oil. He found a reference to it in an old letter he came across when sorting my father's effects. I had not known." He was quiet for a moment. "That is something to build on." "Yes," she said. "I thought so." Lady Fairbridge returned to the room. Edmund finished his tea and took his leave with correct formality. At the door he paused and turned back, and said to Lady Fairbridge that he hoped to see her company at the Patmore dinner on the 23rd. Lady Fairbridge said she expected to be present. He did not look at Cecily when he said it. He did not need to. She had understood him. What she had not understood, until the evening of the 23rd, when he stood in the center of the Fairbridge drawing-room, and said Lady Patmore, and said I have expressed no such intention. and crossed the room in her direction was how completely she had been seen. Not the parcel, not the practicality of the conveyance, not the shared assessment of the South Gate wall. Her. The woman who had walked into this house in dove gray and been decided upon by the room before she opened her mouth. The woman who had been spending her best years in reduced circumstances and whose scope for advancement was insufficient. The woman who had made an offer on 12 acres and worked in the margins of another woman's household correspondence and signed her name at a table where her father had made her read Latin. He had stood in front of 30 witnesses and made the calculation in the opposite direction from every calculation the room had made about her. This was the thing. Not the declaration, though the declaration was specific and sufficient, and exactly what it needed to be. The thing was that he had looked at what the room had decided about her, and had decided differently, and had decided it at the cost of everything the room had arranged, and had not appeared to calculate the cost at all. She had said, "I accept the proposal practically, and rather more than that." She had meant, in truth, "I have been waiting, without knowing I was waiting, for someone to stand in the lavender field with me. I have been waiting for a second pair of shears set on a wall. I have been waiting to be read correctly. I have been," she had thought, "found. The spring morning in the lavender field. The cold light, and the bent stems, and the two of them working steadily from opposite ends toward the center, which is where the thing they were building had always been pointing." She reached the end of her row before he reached his. She stopped and looked at what remained of the winter's work. The cleared stems, the turned earth at the roots where the crown would send up the new growth. The smell of it even now. Cold and faint and entirely Thornfield. Entirely the specific smell of the place she had grown up inside and had thought she had lost. She did not have it back. She had something better, perhaps. Something she had earned back. And she had done it herself. And she had done it in the company of a man who had understood from the beginning that this was what she needed and had not once offered to do it for her. He looked up from his row and met her eyes across the field. "Nearly done," he said. She looked at the cleared ground and the bare crowns and the long winter behind her. "Yes," she said. "Nearly done."